Oh, I am, wait a minute.
Hold on, Marna, you just muted. You'll have to unmute again.
Okay.
There you go.
There
can hear
I
you.
go. How do I get onto the,
You're perfect. We can see you.
oh,
We can hear
okay,
you.
okay. Well, I'd like to, first of all, the book is called The Quiet Americans by Scott Anderson. And Scott Anderson has quite a history. He's written many, many books. He's written Lawrence in Arabia, which got the National Book Critics Circle Award and was a bestseller in the New York Times. And The Quiet Americans was one of the 10 best books in Amazon and one of the 100 best books in the New York Times for 2020. And one of the books, some other books that he's written were Moonlight Hotel, The Man Who Tried to Save the World, Triage, and so on. And those were fictional books. And this is a nonfiction book. And he's contributed to the New York Times Magazine, GQ, Esquire, and Vanity Fair also. One of the things, and believe it or not, many, many years ago, he was embedded with the Israeli army. I don't know if you remember that, Scott. But,
yeah, I remember.
He was also on the boat that was rescuing Syrian refugees when they were fleeing during the war from Doctors Without Borders, and that became a book called The Fractured Lands. You can probably get all these books on Amazon if you're interested. And so Scott's had quite an adventure. He was a foreign correspondent and an author. So now I'll turn it over to Scott.
Thank you, Marna, and thank you all for joining. It's a real privilege to talk to you all. So I was going to start just by saying a little bit about how I came to write The Quiet Americans. I grew up overseas. My father was an agricultural advisor for the American government, and so I grew up in East Asia, in Taiwan and Korea and Indonesia in the 1960s. And I didn't really live in the United States until I was a teenager in the 1970s. But one thing that all those countries that I grew up in had in common was that they were all right-wing military dictatorships being supported by the American government. So I was very much kind of a product of the Cold War. I mean, we all were to a degree. I think maybe in my case, it was more acute. I remember the entrance to my elementary school in Taiwan had an anti-aircraft gun on a mounted swivel. And every day going to school, I'd pass this anti-aircraft gun where there would be two Republic of Chinese soldiers with binoculars scanning the skies for signs of incoming Red Chinese squadrons. So it was very much part of my growing up, and I was alternately, I was, as a bloody-minded little boy, I was both kind of thrilled and terrified at the idea that war might break out at any time. But as I got older, and as Marta mentioned, I was a war correspondent. I spent time in Central America in the mid-1980s, at a time when the American government, the Reagan administration, was supporting a string of right-wing military dictatorships, and essentially death squad governments. So they were murdering their own people, and I had this idea of that I've always wanted to study the Cold War, and it kind of comes down to like this kind of crucial question of like, kind of what happened? How did America kind of lose its way in the Cold War? In 1944, FDR was talking about how the World War II was going to mean the end of colonial empires, especially the British and French empires that had caused so much dissension throughout the Third World. And America was going to be this herald of democracy around the world. And within about, in fact, exactly 12 years from FDR saying that in 1944, The United States is instead bankrolling maintaining the imperial powers of Britain and France around the world. And the United States is overthrowing democratic regimes in places like Iran and Guatemala. So the idea for the book was, what happened? What happened in that 12-year period where everything changed so dramatically? Because I really think that what happened in the immediate aftermath of World War II really, it set the template for what was coming with the Cold War for the rest of the time. So in trying to think about how to write this, though, I'm not a trained historian, and the kind of history I like to write is where so-called ordinary people are at the center of great events. And I thought, well, who was at the ground zero of the early Cold War, and participants of it, observers of it, eyewitnesses to what was happening. And the answer that came to me was, well, spies of both sides. Because of the nature of the Cold War, it was not, by and large, a shooting war. It was a war about espionage and skullduggery. So it was really very much, it was spies who were in the front lines of this conflict. So with that in mind, which was kind of a lucky thing, because everyone likes to read about spies. So what I set out to do was to try to find people in the CIA who had served in different areas of the world during this time, to kind of get a sense of what all America was doing around the world, and who were doing cool things out in the field. So that was kind of my basic parameters of the sort of people I wanted to find. And I had imagined that at the outset that I would have, 15, maybe 20 people to choose from, men, because at the time, CIA field agents were only men, unfortunately. I would have loved to have had a woman character. But in fact, I ended up with exactly 4 men. There was not a fifth, because to find people who were doing interesting things, who had an interesting arc to their story, it ended up being these 4 men. So I'm mainly going to talk about one today. I'll just briefly mention the other 3. But one thing I was going to say, all 4 of these men came out of what was called the Office of Strategic Services, which was America's wartime intelligence agency, actually headed by a Buffalo native, William Donovan. So all 4 of these men had served in the OSS during World War II. When the CIA was created in 1947, they all joined up in that and then operated in different parts of the world. So just to briefly mention the 3, one is named Michael Burke. And in the book, I described Michael Burke as James Bond before James Bond existed. He was extraordinarily handsome, extraordinarily charming. People who knew him, invariably, when I was talking to people, he's long since dead, but invariably, if I ask people who remember him, they always, the first word they say is charming. But he was sent off to Italy to organize these anti-communist partisans who were going to be airdropped into Albania. Albania, right across the sea from Italy, was a Soviet satellite state. And the idea was to airdrop these anti-communist partisans behind the lines to spread propaganda and hopefully to foment an uprising in the country. From the Albanian operation, which was really America's first kind of infiltration operation against the Soviets, Michael Burke went on to Germany. He headed all the covert operations out of Germany, these infiltration operations into Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Another character his name is Ed Lansdale. Lansdale had been an ad executive in San Francisco, and he went out to Asia for the CIA, and he was first sent to the Philippines, where in the Philippines, in the immediate aftermath of the war, there was a kind of growing anti-communist insurgency. The Philippines was ruled by a very corrupt oligarchy, essentially a colony of the United States, and the United States had helped keep this oligarchy in power for the previous 40 years. And Lansdale, coming from this ad background, just had this very simple idea of if you want to defeat the communists, you have to give the people a government they believe in and a government that's working for them. You have to give them a stake in the system. So Lansdale proceeded to, he kind of teamed up with a Filipino senator who he engineered to first become defense minister and then to become the president of the country, Raymond Magsaysay. And kind of between he and Magsaysay, they defeated the communist insurgency, really through the kind of the meeting of their two minds. He had such great success in the Philippines that when he came back, Lansdale came back to Washington in 1954, the CIA director said, you know, we're having a problem in another place in Asia, Vietnam. He said, we want you to just go to Vietnam and do the same thing in Vietnam that you did in the Philippines. So Lansdale went off to the Philippines. He was the head of the first military mission in Vietnam, American military mission in 1954. And that mission consisted of him and 12 other guys. And in fact, he came quite close to achieving almost what he had achieved in the Philippines. And then, as we all know, it all went south. The third person I was just going to briefly mention was Frank Wisner, who was the overall administrator of what was called the Office of Policy Coordination of the CIA, which were all the covert operations, the black operations taking place around the world. So he was mostly in Washington. He's kind of in a way, kind of the narrator of the book, because he was the one guy who saw everything was going all over the place. And that brings us to Peter Sichel. Peter Sichel is the fourth main character in the book. And Peter is really kind of the proverbial kind of, finding a chest of letters in an attic somewhere. Peter's still alive. He's 98 years old. He lives in Manhattan, sharp as a tack. I interviewed Peter probably 8 or 9 times, and he's got this amazing story. So he was from a German Jewish family in Mainz, Germany. The family fled Nazi Germany in 1935. They got to France, and they were in France when the Vichy took over. He and his family managed to escape again from the Vichy. They went into Portugal and got on a ship to New York. So when the Americans came into World War II, Peter was a stock boy working at a shoe wholesaler in Manhattan. And because he was a fluent German speaker, he was brought into the OSS. The first 2 years of World War II, Peter was doing a job I'd never heard of before, but he was called a special currency trader. And basically what he was doing is there was a huge black market in currency going on all through World War II. And for commandos to be dropped behind enemy lines, of course, they needed the local currency, the money that was being used in those occupied countries. So for 2 years, Peter was buying up French francs, Italian lira, German marks, and this very complicated trading in gold and basically raising money for all these infiltration operations behind the enemy lines. And he was so good at it that one thing he did for his personal consumption, he managed to buy an entire wine cellar, a stocked wine cellar in Algeria, which made him very popular among his senior officers and his colleagues. He got the nickname the Wunderkind because he was just after doing the currency trading, he went on to doing this operation where he was infiltrating German POWs into Nazi Germany to spy, and then infiltrating them back out again so they could report on what was happening on the other side of the battle line. At the end of World War II, the tensions between the Americans and the Soviets were building. In fact, they'd already started building even before the World War II was over. Peter was chosen to head the covert operations unit in Berlin. And already Berlin was the former German capital. It was occupied by 4 powers. It was already becoming the ground zero of the Cold War. But just to show you how kind of clueless the Americans were of this new conflict they were facing, in Berlin by the fall of 1945, there were hundreds, probably thousands of Soviet intelligence officers operating. Peter was the head of the covert operations unit for the Americans, which consisted of him and 8 other guys, and he had just turned 23. So not to take anything away from how brilliant Peter was, but it just shows you how outmatched they were. Peter stayed in Berlin until 1952. He ran all kinds of. If anyone's seen the movie The Third Man with Orson Welles, it was done back probably in the 50s. Post-war Berlin was very much like that. Anyone could be bought and sold for a pack of cigarettes, literally. American cigarettes were the semi-official currency of Berlin at the time. He sent hundreds of spies across into Soviet-held Eastern Germany, East Berlin, and to parts further on. He at times he was working with former Nazi intelligence officers because they were the ones who had knowledge of what was happening in Eastern Europe from the war and inside the Soviet Union because they had fought there. And it's at a certain point he's running so many operations, and some of the people he's working with are so notorious, they're wanted for war crimes, that Peter's actually hiding them from the American military that is trying to capture them. And I talked to Peter at length on this, and his feeling was, look, we were at a war, and we had to work with the people who had knowledge and who were available to us, and often it was the former Nazi officers. He was also involved with Michael Burke, the first man I mentioned, in a lot of these infiltration operations going into Eastern Europe. Almost uniformly, those operations were utter disasters. The Soviets had these emigre organizations were operating in Western Germany. They had them thoroughly infiltrated, so that almost from the moment these guys parachuted into Eastern Europe, the secret police were waiting to pick them up. Hundreds of people just disappeared. And this went on for 5 or 6 years, and in virtually every country, it was a disaster. Peter ended up coming back to, well, I should say, these operations are such a disaster that Peter started canceling them. Case officers would come to him and say, "Hey, I'm working with this group of Czechs. We're trying to infiltrate them into Czechoslovakia," and Peter would cancel the operation because so many of these had been such disasters. He's transferred back to Washington, and because of, and it's right at the height of the McCarthy era, one of the main reasons he comes into suspicion by McCarthy and the people around him is that he had canceled so many operations that this rumor had started within the CIA that maybe Peter was actually KGB. So he was investigated. Of course, there was nothing to it. He was cleared. He ends up going out to Hong Kong as the CIA station chief there, and he's there until 1960. And in 1960, the new number 2 man in the CIA comes out and has a meeting of the CIA station chiefs in the entire region of Southeast Asia, and he announces this new program. At this point, Mao has long since taken over in mainland China. The deputy chief comes in and says, we're going to launch a new operation to destabilize Mao's China. We're going to spend $100 million dropping anti-communist Chinese partisans behind, into China with the idea that they're going to start a revolution. And having lived through all this experience in Berlin, during a break in this conference, Peter went up to the number 2 man in the CIA and said, "You know what? We would save so much time and money if we just killed them ourselves." And he said, "I'm out." And he at that conference, he just quit the CIA. He moved back to New York, and he took over his family's wine business. I forgot to mention at the beginning that his family back in Germany had been these kind of prominent wine distributors, wine merchants that had operated in Germany and France and in England, Sichel and Sons. And so, and Peter proceeded to make Sichel and Sons one of the biggest wine distributors in the United States. And he was responsible, I'm sure a lot of you remember Blue Nun, it's white wine. And Peter marketed, and he was kind of a brilliant marketer, and he made Blue Nun one of the biggest wine sellers, actually the biggest white wine import in America for about 15 years. And if people have had Blue Nun, it's really quite I don't know if it's still around, but I remember it. It's a pretty ghastly, sweet Riesling wine. And I'll just finish by saying one thing. I got very friendly with Peter. In fact, we still email back and forth all the time. And I was kind of joking with him one day. I said, Peter, I can understand, when you were working in Berlin, times were crazy, overthrowing, foreign governments, assassinating foreign leaders, working with former Nazis. Okay, times were strange, but Blue Nun, what were you thinking? And Peter has this kind of wonderful Central European accent, and he goes, "Well, Scott, do you know the old saying that every people gets the government it deserves?" And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "Well, every people get the wine they deserve too." So, so he has no guilty conscience about inflicting Blue Nun on us. So that's kind of my little presentation, and I imagine you have some questions, so I'll go to that. So.
Oh, thank you. That was so interesting. You actually covered a lot of things in the questions that I wrote down. You got right to that. So it was great. But and I thought your book was just fascinating.
Thank you, Phyllis.
But I imagine that you were not at all surprised by the announcement recently that Russia has hacked into so many of the U.S. agencies, and that this has been going on since March, and that nobody knew about it. And I wonder if you could speak a bit to that, and maybe to why you think that our espionage or our intelligence stuff is going on the way it is, or sort of like you said before, going south. And
right, it's a great question. And it goes right back to the book that the Soviets have always, from the time that we developed an antagonistic relationship with the Soviets, which essentially was 1944 on, they've always been able to run circles around us. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One, they come from an informant culture. When the Soviets, like in East Berlin, when in the areas they were in control, they would immediately create this informant culture where everybody, the garbage man, the postman, the shopkeeper, they were all reporting back to their KGB control officer. The Soviets would also do things. It's a thing called a dangle operation, and one thing that the Soviets were doing in the late 40s, and they did it right up until, they're probably still doing it now, but certainly until 10 years ago, they would send across a false defector, somebody who was actually still working for the KGB, but would present themselves to the West as, hey, I want to escape and everything. And to build up that defector, that false defector's bona fides, he would rat out up to a dozen of his own colleagues who were involved in real operations. So they would sacrifice their own people in order to have a more important operation go forward. And this is something that the CIA, the CIA has done a lot of kind of nasty things around the world over the years, but they just never would have conceived of doing. You wouldn't sacrifice one of your own colleagues in order to build up another operation. So the Soviets then and the Russians now have always been much more cunning and frankly much more cold-blooded than the Americans or the Western powers could ever be. And there's certain things that they're very, very good at. And that's, to your question of what's happening today. They're very good at cyber war. They and I think it comes from this, they have again, I'm speaking in broad terms and kind of stereotypes, but they come from a culture where deception is just par for the course. And this was all through the Soviet era. People practice deception, on a day-to-day level, and they're very good at it. And frankly, when you have a somewhat open society and a democratic society, a determined closed society can run circles around it. And my feeling, not to get into current politics that much, but we've basically it was very clear that the Russians were very involved in the 2016 election. They suffered no repercussions for that at all. In fact, if anything, they were kind of encouraged to continue to do it. So the fact that this has gone on, and I think that they decided there was absolutely no risk involved in continuing to do this.
So would, if the intelligence agencies in our country asked you for advice, what would you say that they could do differently than what they're currently doing? Because it's certainly not working.
Yeah, I mean, with the cyber stuff, I don't know what advice I could give because I barely know how to like get on the line. But you know what? One thing that's I've noticed around the world. You know, I've been all through the third world, and one thing I've noticed, and this has been really accelerated since September 11th, is that the American both CIA and State Department abroad in embassies, they're so concerned now with their own security that they basically live inside bunkers. So I think they have very little sense of what's happening in countries. I'll just give you an example. I was in Sudan about 12 years ago covering a war in Darfur. And I was going to interview the #2 man at the American Embassy in Khartoum. And I've never dealt with security like trying to get into the American Embassy in Khartoum. The entire building was encased in kind of bomb-proof thick metal chicken wire, maybe 7 layers of security to get into the building. Tighter security, I've been in the White House once. It was tighter security getting into the American Embassy in Khartoum than it was to get into the White House. But the flip side of that is, what are those people in that building? What are they seeing about the country they're in? Because they live in a compound immediately adjacent to the embassy. If they leave the compound, they go in bulletproof cars and in motorcades. So the Americans are really they've really kind of ended up operating in blind in a lot of these countries, and in a way that the Soviets don't, the Chinese don't. I was in Oslo a few years ago in Norway, and even the American embassy in Norway looks like a fortress. So I think that really works against the Americans. And I don't know how you change that, but I think that if you're so hyper nervous about security, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So long story short, when I actually got to interview the #2 man at the American Embassy in Sudan, he asked me questions. I mean, I knew far more of what was happening in the field than he did, and I don't think he was playing dumb. I think he really was just operating from ignorance. So,
a question just came in where people seem to be interested in knowing more about Donovan because of his background in Buffalo. Do you have any insights or anything you want to share about him?
Yeah, Donovan was just a fascinating man. He was a lawyer. He had actually he was in law school at Columbia with FDR, and he'd served in World War I. Actually, still today is one of the most decorated American war heroes. He won the Congressional Medal of Honor, and I mean every medal. As a lawyer in the 1930s, he was both in Buffalo and in Manhattan. But he basically kind of, almost as an excuse to just get out and have adventures, he started just traveling all around the world, and supposedly to report back to his clients. He was a corporate lawyer, and so what's happening in China, what's happening in Africa. But what he essentially did was to create his own sort of private intelligence agency. And so he made a lot of trips to Germany in the 30s, saw the rise of Hitler, and to the point where he became part of members of FDR's kind of so-called kitchen cabinet. He became one of his closest advisors. And one of the guys who really understood what was happening in the world. America was a very parochial country in the 1930s and still had very little knowledge of what was happening around the world. And Donovan was one of the people who was reporting directly to FDR and saying, hey, what's happening in Germany, you better be watching it because this is going to get worse. So when the Americans came into the war, and FDR decided to create America's first foreign intelligence agency, he put Donovan in charge of it. And that was the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. When the CIA was created, Donovan very much hoped he would be chosen to head it, Truman, for some reason, the interesting thing I've never quite figured out with Donovan, for some reason, and I think it went beyond just bureaucratic infighting, he had a tremendous number of enemies. And Truman, from a first meeting with Donovan, just took an instant dislike to him, fired him, shut down the OSS, and then 2 years later, when the CIA was created, Donovan was kind of angling to be made the director of it. And at that point, his real enemy was J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, he had pretensions of the FBI becoming the International Intelligence Agency, despised Donovan going back to the 1920s, and so kind of put the knife in Donovan's back. But the level of antipathy that comes up again and again with Donovan is something that I still don't fully understand. I think part of it was that he was Catholic. And I think that even in the late 1940s, early 1950s, the American government, and especially the intelligence side of things, was very much run by the old boy network of WASP from New England, and Donovan was kind of seen as an interloper.
All right, we have another question, and it's about anti-Semitism. Was there anti-Semitism in the CIA? And people had read that there might have been, and just any insights that you might have about that.
It's funny, I was just talking about Donovan, and it's interesting that in the OSS during the war, I'll start with that, there wasn't at all. And Donovan very much had this idea of whatever worked. So there were communists in the OSS, and which worked against Donovan later on when he was trying to run the CIA. That came back to haunt him, because Hoover could say, he was employing all these communists in OSS. The same thing's going to happen in the CIA. I think there was probably the same sort of anti-Semitism that existed just in American society in general in the 40s and 50s. And again, I mentioned that the early CIA, although funnily enough, not the four men I write about, it did tend to be these kind of old family WASPs in the early CIA who were in senior positions. They'd all gone to Princeton or Yale. And so I think that from an institutional standpoint, I've never gotten the sense that there was, because there was this idea of whatever would work. And so Peter Sichel, who's Jewish, who becomes very senior in the early CIA, certainly everybody knew he was Jewish, but because he was effective, that was more important. I think that probably if there was anti-Semitism, it was just kind of like it was part of the parcel of what was going on in American society at the time.
Okay, thanks. And another question is, does the fact that Putin had been part of the KGB offer any insight into his character or actions?
Oh yeah. Yes, absolutely. I wrote an article about 10 years ago. I had covered the war in Chechnya in 95. And just to give a quick thing of how Putin came to power, he was the third prime minister under Yeltsin in 1999, the third one in a year. And he had just been rotating him in, and Russia was a mess. And the Russians actually pulled out of Chechnya, and Chechnya had its own kind of autonomous republic. In 1999, 3 weeks after Putin comes into the office as prime minister, as the latest prime minister, there's a series of apartment building bombings in Moscow that kill, 350 people, and it's blamed on the Chechens. And Putin uses as a pretext to launch the Second Chechen War, and just proceeds to turn Chechnya into a scorched earth. There are all kinds of suspicions, of which I'm absolutely convinced, that in fact it wasn't the Chechens that did the apartment building bombings. It was the KGB. It was Putin's buddies, and they did it as a way to propel him to power. It was Putin's, essentially his Reichstag fire. And I went to Russia and interviewed two KGB officers who had investigated the apartment building bombings. One in particular who had been in prison for 3 years because he became convinced that it was actually an inside operation, that the KGB had done it. When I wrote this article for GQ magazine, basically saying this is how Putin came to power, I got death threats out of Russia. I can't go to Russia now because, I mean, Putin has a long memory. I'm certainly, a persona non grata there. Long story short, he's absolutely cunning. Murders his opposition at will, and certainly the last few people that have been murdered who are opposition leaders, I think it's gotten to a point now where he doesn't even have to give directly the kill order. The people right around him know what he wants, and so these operations go on. The guy who was almost killed a few months ago. Anyone who stands out is liable to be murdered.
Let's see. We have let me just check and see any other questions. Oh, could you comment on the network series, The Americans, and also Gordon Carrera's book, Russian Among Us?
I never have watched The Americans. people always say, "So what do you think of The Americans?" And I say, I actually don't watch much TV and stuff. I keep meaning. My plan is to actually. I would like to watch The Americans. I gather there's a lot of things that are quite accurate about it. One thing I was going to say, the other thing that I think this ties in with the Americans. Yes, it does tie in with the Americans. So another thing the Soviets do, I talked about like the false defectors that they send across, but what they also did throughout the days of the Soviet Union is they sent across sleeper agents. And the main place they did that was out of Berlin, because Berlin was the one sort of open transit point between East and West until 1961, when the Berlin Wall was built. And when they finally built the Berlin Wall in 61, one thing that a lot of Americans were in the government were wondering is like, why didn't they do this earlier? Because there was this whole going back and forth. And what they discovered was when the Berlin Wall came down in 89 or 91, the Soviets had actually liked having Berlin being this open city because they used that as an infiltration route going the other way. And they sent across thousands of sleeper agents from Eastern Germany into Western Germany. And some of these people would be activated 3 years down the road. Some of them were not activated until the 1970s. Some were never activated at all. But so basically the Soviets had thousands, just in Western Germany, thousands of sleeper agents situated everywhere, in the government, in the post office, at Mercedes-Benz, everywhere. And they would activate them if the need arose. So it again goes to this idea of the complete pervasiveness of the KGB through, and that was just Western Germany, and of course it was happening in the States also. A lot of not, I wouldn't say a lot, but some Soviet Jews who came out in the 1970s, they were also sleeper agents who came to the States. It was this whole concerted effort that went on for decades. And so I gather the Americans, from what I hear of the program, it's about sleepers, and what they would always hold over the sleepers was that because obviously a lot of the sleepers, when they were exposed to the West, life looked much better, but part of their family was still back in the Soviet Union. What was going to happen to them if they defected? And in many cases, they actually would keep a child back. A couple would come over with 2 kids, and they'd keep 2 of the children back in the Soviet Union with the grandparents. So really pretty cunning stuff they do.
So somebody's asked the question, how do you think that CIA recruits their agents. And I don't think it's because anybody who's watching really wants to be a CIA agent. They just want your insights.
Yeah. Well, now today, most CIA, CIA has always had this very strange dual function, which on one hand, it's intelligence gathering, and on the other side, it's this kind of covert operations side of things. So in the period I was writing about and the people I mainly focus on, they were doing covert operations, but probably back then, even half, maybe even more than half, were analysts. And so it's kind of like librarians and cowboys, are being the two groups. And so the kind of librarians, the analysts who are sitting in Langley and in Washington, I think that's a very kind of traditional way of recruiting. It's people who are coming out of good universities, often will have a language faculty, often will have done something else. They'll be economists for a few years, or they've served overseas. They were in the Peace Corps. So you have that. You have the analyst side of things, and at different times, certain times, certainly before September 11th, the analyst side of the CIA was probably 90%, and so your covert operators was maybe the kind of the James Bond guys. It was maybe 10%, and people undercover in foreign countries and stuff. Now that's expanded since September 11th because you have more covert operations going on around the country. But there's also this very strange kind of floating back and forth between the CIA and the State Department, the military, private business. I'll give you the story. I was working on this other book project earlier, and I had the man I was writing about who had disappeared in Chechnya, but he had worked in northern Iraq in the immediate aftermath of Operation Desert Storm, and he had been involved in rescuing these Iraqi Kurds who had rebelled against Saddam Hussein, and then the Americans had left him in the lurch. Anyway, he had worked with this American military colonel, a reservist military colonel, and I tracked this guy down in Sarajevo during the Bosnian War, where he was working in this super clandestine American military unit in the capital of Bosnia while the war was going on. And he happened, it came up where I said, he said, "Where do you live?" I said, I live in New York. And he said, "Oh, I live in New York. I'm only here for the next 2 weeks. Let's get together when I'm back in New York." And he gave me his business card, and he was a vice president at Citibank. And that wasn't his cover. He was a reservist. Part of his job was Citibank, and then periodically he'd leave Citibank to go off and do these black operations for the American government. So it's tremendously difficult to figure out who is who and all this stuff, and especially when you're on the clandestine side of things, because people kind of float in between jobs. And I'm sure that that's by design. That you have a special operation. Go, oh, what about the guy at John Deere? Why don't we bring him in for a couple of months, and then he goes back to his normal job. So he becomes kind of untraceable, or she. So
yeah. There were quite a few comments for people who have read other books by you and really enjoyed them, and wondering what you're working on next.
It's funny you ask, because I actually just on Friday, the contract hasn't been inked, but it's settled. The next book it's going to be on the Iranian Revolution in 1979. So it's kind of my trilogy of great American screw ups around the world. So it's part 3. But the Shah is just this fascinating figure. And so I've just started doing research on it. And the nice thing about this project is that we're just now that much further into the future that a lot of people are still alive that I can interview. Where with the Quiet Americans, it was pretty much Peter Sichel at 98, and kind of a find to find him still alive. But everybody else was deceased. But for this book, I'll have a lot more people that I can who they'll be in their 70s and 80s, but who were there and remember what went on. So
Does that mean you'll also head out to Iran?
Yes, yeah, I'll go to Iran. Yeah, yeah. In fact, I've already kind of worked, tried to make some contacts there, and it should. I don't think it'll be a problem for me to go in. So, provided we don't go to war in the next 30 days with Iran. No.
Let's see. Let's see. Oh yeah, here's another question. When you interviewed Peter, did he express any regrets about his work?
No, he didn't. He did. I mean, no. He. It's funny. I think that he is extremely rational, and that he made this decision in his mind that I've signed on for this new conflict. I'm going to be getting into bed with some really unsavory people, but this is part of the mission I've accepted. I'll give an insight into his personality. We were talking one day. He at the time in the closing days of World War II, he'd been attached to the 7th Army. The 7th Army was coming through southern Germany. They were the ones who liberated Dachau, and Peter said that, I've always had this recurrent nightmare all my life that I was one of the men in the in the barracks, just waiting to die, waiting to be taken away. And this is a nightmare that I've had my entire life and everything. And he said, but this is not something you share with other people. This is him talking. He said, no, I would never tell my wife about that. And he said, and you certainly can't let it color your judgment. And he said, I think I had survivor guilt because, why did I live when so many people, he talked about the Jewish population of Europe, when so many people were killed. Why did I survive? But I couldn't let that color my judgment. And then here's a guy who just a few months later, after seeing Dachau, he's working with former, German military intelligence in Berlin. And he said to me, he said, whenever I would hire an agent, a German, they always wanted to have the conversation with me. And the conversation was, I was always against Hitler. I hid Jews in my basement. And he would always shut them down. He'd say, I don't want to hear it. He said, I don't care what you did in the war. That's between you and your conscience. All I care about is what you do from now on. So it really is this very kind of coldly rational way of looking at the world. And I think it's why he was such an excellent spy master, because he was able to separate any emotionalism from it. But one time this one conversation I remember, it was actually the very last interview I had with him. He helped a really pretty notorious a man wanted for war crimes to come into the U.S. And to essentially escape justice. This guy, his name was Otto von Bolschwing, and he ended up being the highest-ranking Nazi war criminal to ever be deported from the United States in 1971, or maybe even a bit later. But Peter helped get him to the States in 1954 or something. And I remember I couldn't. It's very easy to sort of stand in judgment of what somebody did 50 years ago. And I remember this one day, I wanted to ask him about von Bolschwing, and I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I mean, I just thought, well, who am I to do my moralizing, but he kind of knew where I was going. And he said, look, we were at war, and like every war, this was a dirty war. And he said, and at that time, I believed things that even a few years later, I no longer believed. And he said, that's it. That's all he would say by explanation. So.
Okay, there's one last question, and that's, let's see. Okay, do you have any insight into the government's treatment of Jonathan Pollock? Oh,
Jonathan
Pollard,
Pollard.
sorry.
Paul
There's-
Pollard.
Yeah, sorry. Without my glasses.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, yeah. I mean, you know, basically, he was. It's an interesting question to end on, because there is this ethos in American intelligence that if you're a traitor, if you pass information to anybody, you're still a traitor. It's, you know, it's okay. It's worse if you're passing information to the Soviets or to I still call them the Red Chinese, because I grew up growing up in Taiwan. There's still the Red Chinese to me. But likewise with Israel. Like, I mean, so Pollard within the fraternity of the CIA and the NSA, he is seen as a traitor. And you know, somebody who passed information to the Canadians or to the Brits would be seen as the same way. That you've taken this oath that you live by, and it's not up to you. You do not have the prerogative to decide for yourself of like, oh, okay, you know, I won't pass information to the Russians, but I'll pass it to the Canadians or the Israelis. And you know, interestingly, even Peter Sichel, at 98 years old, who's been out of the CIA since, well, for 50 years, right? 60 years. There's things he will not talk about. I mean, he still has this code of silence 6 years later. And it's funny, I got a call from a guy probably about a month ago, a former ambassador who's been friends with Peter Sichel for the last 50 years, and very close friends. He and his wife had gone on a Rhine River cruise with Peter and his wife about 15 years ago. Very close friends. And he said, you know, I've known Peter for 50 years. He never told me he was in the CIA. And this guy was a former American ambassador. You know, I mean, he's been vetted. He's had a security clearance and everything. And so I said, I asked Peter about it. Actually, just last week, I said, you know, I got this call. He said he'd never told me you're in the CIA. He said, well, you know, I assumed he just knew that I was. And if he'd asked me, I would have told him, but he never asked. So.
Before we turn it back to Katie for the buys, I just want to thank you so much for doing
my
this.
pleasure.
It's really wonderful having you, and I think we all got a great deal out of it, and it's great meeting you, and want you to enjoy the rest of your vacation here.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Phyllis.
Back to Katie.
Great questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Phyllis, and thank you, Scott. That was really, it was fascinating. And if you haven't read the book, I certainly encourage everybody to read it and get a copy. The reminder email that was sent out today with the link for the Zoom also included a link where you could purchase a copy of the book. So definitely look into that. And this was really wonderful. Hopefully, maybe after your next book, we can get you back. I think we have a local connection. Marna, thank you so much for arranging this, and for Hadassah for letting the JCC be part of it, and again, open it up to the Buffalo community. So I'm wishing everybody a happy and healthy new year, and thanks, enjoy.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
It was great.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, you guys can feel free to kind of unmute and say your goodbyes if you like. I'll leave it open for a minute or two.
Thank you. That was
Bye.
excellent. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks you all for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Very fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you so
Very
much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Fascinating.
Thank you.
I can't wait to get the book.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, looking forward to reading it.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you. I hope it holds up.
It
Excellent.
will.
All right, everyone. Well, take care.
Okay.
Okay.
You too.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.